Coming prepared for tomorrow. I suppose we have to try to be a little bit realistic about this. What to do about the 150 pages. Especially since you have a 4 o'clock session this afternoon, and a party tonight. So here's what I suggest. Try to find some time between today and tomorrow to tackle this assignment of 150 pages. And if you haven't got a head start on it already, I think it's practically impossible to read 150 pages of Blanc in the time that's there. So suppose I suggest this. Go read the headings of the chapters. That'll at least give you an idea of the sequence, because his chapter headings are fair. That's at least, you'll at least have a synopsis. You'll have some idea of what I'm talking about. Right? And then tomorrow in the presentation, I'll try to be a little fuller and to highlight, bring the book with you, to highlight some of the places in the text that I think need attention. And I have a schema prepared on that conflict with the writing masters and the schoolmasters. And then, over the weekend, go back and read the text, because you really have to read Blanc's account of this thing to get a feel for it. And so suppose we do that. I won't presume that you've read the whole thing when we come here tomorrow. Chris?
I have a suggestion. I don't know if anybody's planning it being the early afternoon of tomorrow, but what if we had the 2-hour sessions, one just before lunch, one right after lunch, and give the morning for reading? We could finish by, if we got back here at 1, by 2 o'clock. Do you have appetite for that?
It's a tough time. That's my nap time, and I wouldn't want to fall asleep in the middle of the second lecture. Gabe?
I was thinking of that 4 o'clock session today. Is there any possibility?
That's stubborn.
Do it my way.
All right, now, the next thing at this chapter was the rules out of the way. We could discuss endlessly about the whole rule thing, and I think that maybe triggered some interesting things for you to reflect on. We come now to the business of vows. Somebody's looking for an interesting project, by the way, would be to trace the actual text of the vow formula, the heroic vow in 1674 and the present one, and to compare that with what Blanc has to say about vows, etc., etc. That might be some interest. Yes, sir.
Well, just before we move on, I want to make a comment.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
About the rule, because it seems to me that, when the first rule was prepared by Lasallian, he at first was a singular author, given to the brother's experiences, and he passed it around and other people read it and everything. You were dealing with fewer people who had a more common experience. And so when Lasallian wrote the rule, it was easier, I think, for them to have agreement. I think they also shared a common set of values. I think by the time 1966 rolled around and the revising the rule, the Institute is much larger. People come from very cultures, I think, have different sets of cultural values. And then there's a lot of negotiating and interest groups are trying to flex their muscle to get into the rule that they want.
Well, sure, that's exactly why the 47 rule, which was basically the same as the 1718 rule, became totally out of tune with the experience of the brothers, because it arose out of a 17th century French thing where it worked, but it wouldn't work in every country in the world. Getting up at 4:30 in the morning was a simple example, or not crossing your legs and any number of other things. Another factor that, of course, this gets terribly complicated, but parallel to the rule, the development of the rule, they began to develop this enormous thing called the Book of Government, which was an administrative structural thing, and then the codification of canon law in 1917. And then finally, by the time we got to 1966, well, then we had a rule, then we had constitutions, and then we had a Book of Government, and then all of a sudden the Vatican comes along and says you have to do the whole thing differently and incorporate all of that into one volume. So the complexity of putting a rule together, the problems were enormous.
But I guess in response to what Gus was saying, whether you know what the rule is, well, it seems to me, Gus, that the rule is a compromise document put together by these various interest groups.
I don't think of it that way. No, that's not what we were trying to do. What we're trying to do with the rule, now we really can't spend too much time on it. What we're trying to do with the rule was to capture, as the Declaration tried to do, the essence of our vocation, to hold on to those fundamental things that came from the founder. I tell people that if you read chapter 1 of the present rule, you've got the whole thing. You don't need anything else. It's all there. Spirit of faith, spirit of zeal, community, the name brother, the ways of maintaining the spirit of faith, how zeal is expressed, the priority of the schools, the service of the poor, open to other things, and the last article that says we have to integrate consecration, community, and apostolic ministry. And that there, it's all in that first chapter. And that's right, still identical with the founder. All the rest of it is simply taking those things and developing them, and our hope was that they could be completely adaptable in any culture. And I don't think there's very much there by way of interest groups. A little bit of problem with some of the stuff to keep the Vatican happy and things like that. But to talk about the rule, I need a week. And, you know, I do retreats on the rule sometimes. So, Gus?
I'm just going to say that the original rule is filled with very many details and a lot of minutiae. It's very concrete. The present rule has very little detail and minutiae. It's a statement of ideals. That's a very great difference between the rule of 47.
It's an attempt to define our vocation. That's really the way to look at the rule. And as such, I don't really think of it as a compromise document, though. I think it was a totally different approach. Now let's get to the vows. All right, and so, well, if you've read this, you know how the founder went around. And apparently he got the 12, now here's where the 12 principal brothers come. By this time it would have been a more select group. And he interviews them one by one. This whole issue was on hold since 1686, where they all made a private vow of obedience and presumably kept renewing it, or some of them did, and some of them didn't. So here he takes this group of 12 and asks them what he thinks. Now remember, not everybody is making these vows. And then when they finally kind of agree on what the vows are going to be, then they go to a private room. Now this will give you some idea of how big the house must have been, huh? If the founder could get these 12 men off to a corner someplace and have them do something as solemn as make perpetual vows and not have the rest of the house know about it, which is an interesting thing because he wasn't sure how ready the rest of them would be for this type of event. So that's an interesting development too. So out of this we get the formula, which is the basis for the formula of vows. Now Bland doesn't give the text of this as he does for the heroic vow. So what Bland has failed to do, I will supply the lack. Because I think we ought to take a look at this. Again, in terms of what I've been saying about the function of vows, this text is basic. Because now the Institute apparently is stable enough for them to consider that the vow of the heroic vow has been realized by this time. And so it begins the same way with the address to the Trinity. By the way, in the English text of the present rule, you have the first paragraph is the same translation that we used in 1967 when Brother Guston and I translated the 1967 rule into English, or supervised and edited the translation. And we left out the adorable. At that time, we thought that to call God adorable, well, you know, you think of your little nieces and nephews, and isn't she adorable and all that sort of thing. And we felt that in English, it didn't say much, and it could be well left out, that it was included in infinite. And I meant to put it back in again, because I was in charge of the English translation of the new rule, and I was going to put the word awesome in there, before your infinite and awesome majesty. In a way, I'm glad I didn't, because that has become such a cliche with the younger ones. I think it originated out here in California. Everything is awesome. Oh, that's awesome. Although in this context, I think it would fit, and that might be, it belongs in there. So anyway, if you use the text of the English rule, that word is missing. But anyway, notice what he's doing this time. I consecrate myself entirely to you to procure your glory. Now, this time it's not specific. as far as I am able and as you will require of me. And for this purpose, I, John Baptist de La Salle, priest, each one of them made the vow separately, apparently, and each one put in his own name. Now notice this, promise and vow to unite myself. So the vows are already being pronounced in the second paragraph. The word vow was dropped from this paragraph at the turn of the century, but it was in there up until about 1900. So what are they vowing? They're vowing I vow to unite myself and to remain in the society with these others, and to keep together by association gratuitous schools. So that's the vow. The vow is to be united in association and to stay with it, to remain. Even if I were obliged to live on bread alone, that dropped out somewhere time after the founder's death, or to do anything in the said society at which I shall be employed, whether by the body or the superior, a vow to do what the body of the society says, which of course will become important in the founder's own life. When they challenge him, you've made this vow to obey the body of the society. And the body of the society comes before the superiors, the tremendously innovative elements here. And then he comes to, wherefore I promise and vow obedience to the body of the society. And here's where the obedience, the original vow, comes in explicitly mentioned at this point, although it's implicit in the previous paragraph. Which vows of association and stability and of obedience I promise to keep. Right? So that's a kind of a recapitulation of everything that's gone before. Now, we had a terrible fight over this in the 1986 chapter. It was the only really disputed question, I suppose, that came up with the whole rule, and the chapter was just about split evenly in two on the question, because the draft that we had proposed for that middle paragraph was to say, remain in the society with the brothers of the Christian schools who are associated to keep together, to work together for the educational ministry, especially for the poor. And all of a sudden, the French came yelling and screaming, "Où sont les jeunes? Où sont les écoles? Where are the schools? What happened to the schools?" Well, we said, not everybody teaches in school anymore. No, we have the schools. That's originally here. Well, we finally agreed to put the schools back in. I should have duplicated the text of the present rule so you can compare it. I suggest you do it yourself. When you begin your daily reading of the rule from here on in, start with the vow form. But so we put the schools back in instead of that vague thing about Ministry of Education. And the people were able to accept it because the word vow had been taken out of the second paragraph. So we figured the second paragraph now has historical meaning in terms of what the founder did. All right? Where it's, in our formula, it's the third paragraph where the vows are specified. And of course, it's only since the Bull of Approbation that we have poverty, chastity, obedience, and then the other vows, which have now renewed names. But if you look at this thing the way it was in 1694, if you look at this thing the way it is, it's nothing to do with standardized religious orders at all. Blanc is talking all the time as if that were the fundamental issue. And all that long discussion about whether or not to make the vow of chastity. One wonders whether that was that central in the discussion, really. And Blanc makes no reference to the possibility of putting poverty in it. Now, the brothers, of course, were poor, terribly poor. We couldn't live as poor as they did. And they were presumably chaste, more or less. Although some hints in the letters they may have had a problem with, as everybody does, again. But this is a totally different thing. They're fundamentally vowing to stay together and to work together to keep the gratuitous schools going. That's what they're vowing, and that's their way of bringing about the glory of God. Now, I'd like you to keep this and bring it tomorrow. We'll use this at the prayer at the beginning of our session tomorrow morning, the first paragraph at least. And I would like to suggest that if we could, as the Institute evolves, and as we get more and more serious about the Lasallian family, I wouldn't have any difficulty asking one of our lay associates, married or unmarried, to make this formula their own. without the canonical implications of the word vow. Because the fundamental thing is, and I think we're speaking about some people in the room here, huh? I wouldn't see any difficulty about thinking of Kelly or Andy or Ron as being able to face the Trinity and say that they're consecrating themselves entirely to procure God's glory as far as they're able to require it. And in some form or other, I think people who work with us, and the members of the more intimate members, if you will, of the Lasallian family, do promise to unite with us for the purpose of the educational work that we do, right? And to be under the direction of the society. Now, some of the technicalities of obedience and so on, but if you're a layperson working in any of our schools, you pretty well learn what the obedience is to the director and spirit. So you see what I mean? And you have to make this kind of a commitment even if you've got to work for a corporation to a certain sense. I think that this is adaptable to a much wider audience. If we go back to the 1694 one, you'd have a much bigger problem with the canonical stuff that this has evolved into. But it goes back to what I said in the beginning about that. Remember when I picked you up on that business of the vows constituting the society? That it's how willing are you to consecrate yourself to this work and to stick together to do it by association? That's the fundamental reality here, and that's a reality that I think we are beginning to learn to share. Okay, end reflections on the rest.
I'd just like to point out that in the second paragraph, the word unite is the vow of association, and the word remain is the vow of stability. That's why in the last paragraph, when you come to the last clause, it says, which vows, and you say, oh, what does that relative pronoun refer to? It refers all the way back to unite, which vow of association, unite, as well as stability, remain, and of obedience, to do anything in the said society for which I shall be employed.
Yeah.
That which refers back to the second paragraph in which all three vows are made. And I think there's a certain loss in taking that word vow out of our present formula in the second paragraph. The second paragraph contains it all, and the last paragraph is simply a reiteration.
And the only problem I have with the reiteration, by the way, is that when the vow of association uses that one word, that has created an awful lot of problems in the discussion too, because people say, well, you're making a vow of association, which is a vow of community. But it isn't association just to associate. It's a vow of association to keep the gratuitous schools.
To keep together.
Yes. Well, to keep the schools together, but to keep the school. See,
That's right.
So the way I would put it is to do the apostolic, to fulfill the apostolic mission of the Institute, to exercise the educational ministry, is the formula I would prefer if we're going to put the word vow back in the second paragraph. All right? Because I think we conceive of our mission as wider now than simply keeping gratuitous schools, although that's an element in the whole. So, well, anyway, I really don't want to get too much further. All right, Frank, quickly, please.
What bothers me, you mentioned a couple of times that this is a private vow, and I'm wondering what the force and the obligation is if it's just a private vow. I mean, these people are doing it almost, when you listen to it, boy, it sounds solemn and everything, but you have mentioned it a few times, it's a private vow. I'm wondering what the obligation of it, the force.
To me, the distinction between private and public it's not important. If you are making a vow, if you stand personally before the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I consecrate myself entirely to you to procure your glory as far as I am able and as you require of me. That's an engagement that you make to this person. And it has its intrinsic force. That's all the force it needs as far as I'm concerned. Whether the church, you sign it up and it's a public vow and the church approves and all that stuff and then dispenses it back and forth. I don't think the church can dispense me from a commitment that I've made in that type of a thing. I think I could dispense myself better if I could have faced the Trinity and say I'm no longer capable of what I thought I could do at one point. Huh? That's juridical and legal from my point of view, and I don't have an awful lot of sympathy for it. Okay?
Yeah.
So all the business about bishops and approval, etc., etc. But this is an engagement, huh? Supposing I make a solemn promise to you to do something or other, say this afternoon or next week, so to give you that thing that you asked for, right? I promised you that. I made that commitment. Where's the binding force? Huh? It's something that I said I would do for you. Or when a man and a woman get married, huh? They commit themselves to one another. The priest there, he's not even necessary. And they can do it if there isn't any priest around for 30 days, according even to the canon law. So there's the binding force. The binding force is that's where the word promise to me sometimes has more punch than vow. If I make a promise, and especially if I make a solemn promise to somebody, a solemn promise, really under solemn circumstances, that's tough. That's as binding as you can get. We think that that's extremely important, that whole business of what it means when we promise something. Some of these words get you, well, I'm beginning to get oratorical and carried away. But as you can tell, I have so strong convictions on some of these things. So the other thing that takes the third element, the rules, the vows, the third important thing in this thing was the decision, the attempt of the founder to get them to elect a brother to succeed him. And of course, we have that very, very important statement on page 139, 140, whereby they finally persuade the founder that he's not listening to the voice of God, that twice now they voted him in, and he'd better accept it. And he keeps giving all these arguments, and Blount's commentary on them is interesting too. But then finally, at page 139, 140, that text down at the bottom, where the very, very important Institute text, where they agree that from here on in, this sets no precedent whatsoever, and that it's our understanding the present election will not be a precedent. After the said John Baptist de La Salle, forever in the future, no one shall be received among us or chosen as superior who is a priest or has received sacred orders, and that we will not accept any superior who has not associated himself with us and not made vows like us and like all those who will be associated with us in the future. All the emphasis is on the association again. We vow to associate to do this work. That's what they're vowing. And so Blount seems to think that the founder sort of conned them into signing it just before the text on page 139 at the bottom. On this point, they were happy to satisfy his desire so as to have him continue without reluctance as the superior, as if the only way they could get him to continue as superior would be on condition that they signed this thing, which apparently Blount hints they did so reluctantly. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that
There are two aspects to this. One is that we don't want priests in the brotherhood, and the other one is that they were trying to prevent parish priests from assuming control of the institute.
exactly, I would think that that's true, sure. Of course, this whole question of the priesthood in the Institute is something else, and that could take us for the rest of the morning to discuss that too. I remember the famous statement of Gabe Moran when that was much discussed back in '66, and somebody said, I don't see any reason why a priest can't become a brother.
I just want to point out the legal character of that document, which reflects the Lasallian thinking, the way of thinking, something he inherited from his father. That's a very legal document.
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, this is not a statement, it's a question. Around 46, wasn't there a question of a priest, I think a Jesuit, being put in charge of the order?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
Gus?
Well, there was a Jesuit priest who wanted to write our rule for us.
Oh, that may be it.
Yeah.
And he was turned down.
Yeah, he was.
That was it.
Yeah.
Anyway, the brothers objected to what it was. I thought it was this idea of the priest.
No, that was in just before the general chapter of 1966.
Oh, yeah.
They had prepared a new rule, and Philip Antoon gave it to this Jesuit canonist to look over, and they were proud as punch of the thing. And the Jesuit said, "Oh, you're way behind the times. We don't think that way anymore in Rome, and that we want a more spiritual type rule." And he said, "By the way, I've written one for an order of sisters. I'd be happy to write one for you." So they said, "Thanks, but no thanks. We've got Michel Sauvage," and so they put him into it.
Could you say a little bit more about what you commented on, about the body of society being more carry more weight than this.
Well, I think that reinforces something that Gus has been insisting on, that the founder was trying to give these men a sense of themselves as a unity, a community, and a society, and that he trusted them to do things together. It's another aspect of the association, that this was your commitment was to this group of men. Again, in the modern terms we use to talk about these things, which I think we recovered in the Book of Government in 1976, not in 66, was to get away from that pyramidal thing of this is superior at the top and all the way down and so on, although the founder is strong in obedience and all that sort of stuff, but to recognize that the decisions of the body of the society are the things that these people are committing themselves to, and that the superiors are the ones who implement that or manage it, if you will, or bring it into reality, but that the fundamental commitment is to the body of the society. It's an aspect of what the association means, I would say. Okay? All right, good. So now in this period between 1694 and 99, it's sometimes referred to as a period of relative peace. The founder was at Vaugirard. He was able to hone up on a lot of his writings. You have all of that. In 1695, there are a couple of dates in here, 1695. I haven't got them up on the board. That's where the dispute with Baudran occurs. This, all of a sudden, Baudran decides he wants to move the brothers out of the Rue Princesse, where they had fairly ample quarters, and move them around the corner to the Rue Guiscard, which is still there. And de La Salle didn't like the house at all, and he thought it was quite inadequate and so on, and so he refused to move. So Baudran says, well, I won't pay the rent anymore. So de La Salle says, well, I'll pay the rent. Well, where are you going to get it? Well, Providence will provide, and currently it did. But then when he gets in trouble later on, then there's a whole problem about who owns that house and who's paying the rent, and so on, as we'll see when he gets in the dispute. Meanwhile, Cardinal Noailles, or he becomes Archbishop first, down from Chalon, so in 1695, he also becomes the Archbishop. And one of his first movements of reform in Paris is to close down all of these private chapels, where people, instead of going to Mass in their parishes, they should do what they do here at St. Mary's and come to a private chapel to fulfill their obligation on Sunday. And they do that in a lot of our colonies, including Manhattan for a while, sometimes still. So again, but he's so impressed with de La Salle and his reputation, and he's known something of that had filtered up from Reims over to Chalon. So he gives the founder carte blanche in many ways. He gives him faculties for life, which come in very handy later on, and so on and so forth. And he gives approval then for putting a chapel in the novitiate. Now that may seem strange to us. You say, of course, if you have a novitiate, you have a chapel, but that wasn't so, as we know from the account, where they had to go to the local church of St. Lambert, or to one of the local chapels by preference instead of the church. And so de La Salle gets in a big fight with the pastor. Blanc can't resist bringing up the whole question of the brothers going to church with their students, or the brothers having their own chapels and so on, because this, as we'll see, it comes in at the end of the founder's life, and it's really what was behind the whole business of the founder being deprived of his faculties in Rouen just a couple of days before he dies. But Blanc, since Blanc is in Rouen and writing everything that's going on in Rouen, somehow or other gets incorporated back into the early text, either by putting it where it doesn't belong or mentioning something that really belongs at a later period. So we'll see this issue arise again. In 1696, we meet for the first time the new pastor of Saint-Sulpice, who is Joachim Trotti de la Chétardy. And Chétardy will be seeing an awful lot of him, especially tomorrow. And in some sense, he becomes, now, keep your eye on this thing. We get a couple of them in today's reading. We had two references in today's reading to the fact that through all of this, there's an enemy at work. And and at the same time, Blanc is saying wonderful things about this Chétardy person and how wonderful he is and how distinguished, which of course apparently he was. So Hernandez, what page is that on? I should have it someplace here. Where Hernandez has a little footnote, page 149. In 1697, he says, actually it was 1696, Blanc can almost be counted on to get the dates wrong. He gets through pastor. Shows no other good work interested him to such a degree as that of the Christian and gratuitous schools. He had inherited not only the parish, but also the piety of de la Barmondière and Baudrin. And he surpassed them in his generosity towards the brothers. And he even seemed to envy de La Salle the honor of having endowed the church with such a necessary institute. Lance got the motives again. And Hernandez remarks in the footnote, quoting Rigaud, this gives us a key to the entire history of the conflict which later on opposed de la Chétardie to the saint and led to so much difficulty in the latter. So Chétardie, that's a question. Is the enemy the same person as Chétardie? Because on the same page all the time, Blanc will be saying that Chétardie is the greatest person that ever came along, and in the same page he'll be talking about the enemy. And so what is the correspondence between the two? And that'll be part of what we have to look at tomorrow. Of course, now I have to tell every group this, and I can't deprive you of an experience that I had with regard to de la Chétardie. In 1971, I was given a sabbatical from Manhattan College. I had just finished 8 years as the chairman of the department and running a graduate program and so on, with very little time to read or do anything, catch up. So they turned me loose, and I decided the best place to go to catch up on what was going on in European theology and in contemporary theology was to go to Louvain in Belgium. So I said to myself, well, how do I get to Louvain? So I took a plane to New Orleans, where I was stuck for 6 days waiting for a freighter. Skeptic that I was never sure the world was round, so I would prove it to myself. If you're going to be stuck for 6 days, I highly recommend New Orleans. So finally the freighter arrived, and I hopped on it and went across the Pacific and stopped at Hong Kong and got off at Manila and stayed with the brothers there for a little while, and then flew to Bangkok, and from there to Delhi, and went up to Agra and saw the Taj Mahal and all that. Came back to Delhi, and I was due to fly from Delhi to Frankfurt. And while I was up in Delhi, foolishly, the very last day I was there, in a hurry to have lunch to catch the plane, I made the mistake of ordering a cold chicken sandwich. And that night, back in Delhi, ready to get the plane in the middle of the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning or some god-awful time. It wasn't Montezuma that had his revenge, but the chicken sandwich certainly did. And so I was in agony all the way from Delhi to Frankfurt, and Frankfurt to Brussels. And I arrived in the brothers' community in Louvain in this very embarrassing state of not having very much bowel control. So the Belgian brothers among themselves, they said, oh, the poor American brother has just arrived. And they said in Dutch, il a un bezoek de Monsieur de la Chétardie. I had a visit from Monsieur de la Chétardie. So this is the Flemish way of referring to this particular person. Now you can begin to understand a little bit that costume that Chris Kavanaugh was wearing, because when that group did the Buttimer Follies, of course, with the cape and everything else, the villain comes in and so on and so forth. And that's why he made clear that he was pronouncing it Chétardie, when I was afraid he was going to give away my story, and maybe he did, but anyway. So, and then of course, the other funny part of that is that I wasn't at all aware of the man's first name, but his middle name, his name is, how do you say Joaquin, I guess in French, Joaquin Trotti, T-R-O-T-T-I. That's his middle name. So that only reinforced the story a little bit. So anyway, you have now been introduced to him, and it's good to be aware of that if we're going to party with these people tonight who took all of this stuff and put it into what got to be known as the Buttimer Follies. Did any of you see it last year at the Convocation? Yeah, they put it on at the Convocation. Some of you may have seen it. They're not going to do it this year, but at least you got to look at the costumes with the wider and wider brims all the time. It's too bad they didn't bring Madame Mayfair with her, because she's here. She's that Jean Leahy who's with the Buttimer 3 group. So okay, so that's so we have Chétardie in place. 1697, the school, in the beginning, of course, he's very, very enthusiastic about these schools. As Baudrillard, this is his parish. Huh? So he opens up the third school in the parish in 1697, and this is on the Rue Placide. Look, I hope you locate all these places on your map. Look at the map as you read these things. That's right down the block from Rue de Sèvres, by the way. It's right on the corner of Rue de Sèvres and the Rue Placide. It's a 2-minute walk from Rue de Sèvres if you're ever in Paris. And this is a very successful school. It succeeds very rapidly. They have to double the classes. Chez-Tardy has all these rich women. This parish, apparently, they must have had a wonderful ladies' auxiliary in this parish. So Madame Voisin is very interested in helping the brothers and giving them what they need for the school. And Chez-Tardy comes there with her and so on. He's proud as punch of the place and so on. But here again, the schoolmasters begin to, again, invading the territory of one of the schoolmasters. So they vandalize the school. De La Salle comes and he sees he can't do anything to stop them, so he says, why don't you take me along with you? So in this instance, they say, oh, it's not you that's the problem, it's the brothers. With Chez-Tardy, of course, it turns to be quite the other way around. So that's kind of an exciting story, but they wound up with 4 classes there. Twice what they would have in an ordinary school. Okay, so then we have a period of expansion. The first expansion takes place within Paris itself. In 1698, when Vaugirard proves to be finally too small. And so they're able finally to get, the founder is able to get enough bucks together to be able to rent this very large thing that at one time had been a convent called the Grande Maison. It had a reputation for being haunted by the ghosts of the old nuns who used to live there and so on. So he got it at a fairly decent price. And it's at this stage that De La Salle begins to see that the administrative duties of the Institute are much too great for him to handle personally. So he appoints another brother, a brother Michel, he's not mentioned by Blanc, as the director of novices, and he appoints another brother as the director of the Paris community, and that turns out to be our friend Ponce. And Gus has already filled you in on the story of Ponce. So, and Blanc will fill us in on some of the subsequent things of that. Notice on page 150, Blanc's judgment here. In the next to the last paragraph, right in the middle. So too, God several times allowed De La Salle to make some serious mistakes in the choice of men to represent him. Very interesting comment. And these two certainly proved to be serious mistakes in the light of the trouble to follow, that leads us into what we're going to have to look at tomorrow. And if you go to page 155, at the end of the 3rd paragraph, it's the first mention, I believe, of the enemy. On this page, he's talking about how Madame Voisin gives 7,000 livres, $70,000 to furnish the house. And these furnishings the founder will keep hold of. As he keeps moving the novitiate, he moves the furnishings of Madame Voisin along with him. So now they finally have beds and mattresses and curtains and things, which they never had at Vaugirard. And so Blanc feels it necessary to remind you that if their dwelling was become more livable, their lifestyle didn't become more pleasant. They still didn't get good meals or anything, and so on and so forth. And at the end of that paragraph, he says, as the number of novices increased, so did their fervor. Never had the Institute been so flourishing. In a short time it began to spread like a great tree, covering Paris and then all of France and bearing fruit, if the enemy had not succeeded in checking its progress. So he's great on the enemy. He'll develop a second enemy when the founder gets down to Marseille, and that creates other problems of identification. So then while he's in the Grande Maison, we have the King James II coming along with his Irish lads. Coutet has done a little bit more trying to fill out some of the information about the Irish lads. So we don't hear, they disappear pretty much after this first year. There's a lot of interesting speculation about them. Would the founder, for example, have taught them Latin? He very well may have. He himself knew Latin, and they might have been needing Latin since they were expected to live at the level of the nobility. Would it have been an adventure into secondary education, where they probably were not as young as the young kids in the grammar schools? A lot of questions about those Irish people. And interestingly enough, when the king comes to visit, the brothers want to push the founder to use that occasion to ask for letters patent, to have James II use his influence with Louis XIV to get letters patent. He says, no, it's not the time. I'm not ready for that yet. And of course, Blanc, who's aware that the Institute has recently received letters patent, as he's got a big hang-up on the letters patent, and he brings them in every once in a while as if they already had them. Not as exactly as if they already had them, but he anticipates. They're all jumping with joy all over one another about letters patent and approval from Rome, which had happened shortly before Blanc was writing. And so that's an interest that he has, and he's always sowing little hints and seeds about it. Then the Rue Placide is vandalized, but it's Madame de Maintenon, again, she was very much involved with the king, and was the one the king finally married her after she was able to persuade him to give up his mistress and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff about Madame de Maintenon. It's not as fresh in my mind as I wish it were at the moment. But she's able to get the furnishings restored at the Rue Placide, or at least to allow them to continue against the writing masters, so that they lose round 2. So the writing masters are defeated, the schoolmasters rather, are defeated first in the Rue du Bac, where the founder wins over them, and also again at the Rue Placide. Neither of those come to anything. But it's building up, and we'll see that thing burst out in full fury tomorrow. All right, now an important development in 1699 as part of this expansion in Paris itself, before we get outside of Paris, is I suppose I should put those in here. I should have in the outline. So we have in Paris, Grand Maison, and the Teacher Training Center at St. Hippolyte in the Faubourg Saint-Marcel. So this pastor, who hears about the founder and the schools and so on, first of all, he's got money to endow a school, and then he asked the founder if he couldn't, and the founder was very interested, in setting up a teacher training school. And so he sets up this teacher training school in the parish of St. Hippolyte, and he sends Brother Nicholas Vouillard there to supervise it. So Vouillard is supervising the teacher training school, and then another brother with him is taking care of the gratuitous school. And they developed this school to train. Again, this was in a suburb area, and the pastor may have known about the thing in Reims, but he saw the need he knew the founder's position about not, on that map it doesn't look very far, but it's a pretty long walk even today to get down into this area. I did it once, and I thought I could walk it, and it took longer than I expected. But anyway, so this training school is set up, and you have the description here of the whole thing going on. And so, but eventually the thing falls apart. Now we'll see more about this in detail tomorrow, but I can't, just in case you missed it, I'm sure you probably didn't. I don't have a page reference here. Can anybody help me with the page right away? 161. 161. So he gets going on Vouillard, and of course he's the Judas, huh, Frank? And he's going on him strongly and strongly. So I love the passage on the bottom of 162. The perfidy. So when the pastor who had this legacy, I was afraid that the school would not survive after him. So he wanted to leave this in his will, that this would be taken care of. Now, he couldn't leave it to the Institute because the Institute had no corporate status. And he didn't seem to want to leave it to De La Salle because De La Salle was not on the scene. Vouillard was the best chosen representative of De La Salle, so he figured rightly that it would be safe enough to leave the money to Vouillard. But when the thing fell apart, then Vouillard decided to treat that as his own money and refused to give it to the founder because he wanted it for the school. So Blanc has this lovely passage. The perfidious disciple of whom we have spoken survived his master, but not for long. After continuing the school in the parish for over 20 years, so Vouillard stayed there teaching. You ever seen that movie of Burkhart, by the way, when he had Bouillard in secular clothes, really dressed up and treating brother? He fell ill of a mortal ailment the day after De La Salle died. The servant of God died on Good Friday, April 7th. And it seemed that on the very next day, what was his first agenda when he got to heaven? He interested heaven in avenging a crime which during his life he had pardoned so wholeheartedly. Oh, heaven must be a lovely place if you can get even with your enemy. The former brother fell ill on Holy Saturday, the day the servant of God was buried, and after 5 months of suffering, he went to give an account to his judge for the tremendous injustice he had been guilty of towards the church, for the affront he had offered his superior, for the scandalous desertion which had shocked his community, and for the complete ruin of the training college for the country schoolmasters which he had brought about. Well, as we will see tomorrow, it isn't that simple. What of course really happened is that there was a court judgment forbidding the brothers personally to operate any kind of an educational institution in association with De La Salle. And this confronted Vuillard and the brother who was with him with a choice. If they continued to wear the habit and continued to have any association with De La Salle, they couldn't continue the school. So Vuillard decided that to save the training college, to keep the training college going, he would abandon the habit and publicly have nothing to do with De La Salle, in order to satisfy what the writing masters by that time had been able to get as a court judgment. The other brother decided to stick with De La Salle and left Vuillard, but then the training school collapsed because it was only Vuillard, and then the money dried up. Vuillard, although he took the money, the tales aren't. I have to be a little fresher on this. But then, so Vuillard is able to continue to teach in the grammar school, and he does so for 20 years, and probably pretty effectively. So Vuillard is not really a traitor. He was trying to do what he thought was the best thing possible to salvage the training college. Now, of course, he had made that heroic vow, but there again, the vow he made, of course, he undoubtedly made the perpetual vow to obey the body of the society, but the body of the society was no longer, it had no longer had any existence. So there's a lot that could be said in justification for Vuillard. Phil?
I couldn't find the name of the parish priest. Do we know his name?
Isn't it in there someplace?
I looked and looked, unless I missed it. I was curious since he left all the money and all that sort of thing, but I couldn't find it.
I think from other sources we may know who it is. I think we may get his name when the lawsuit comes up. Let's wait till then, and I'm pretty sure we know it. Like, offhand, I can't tell you what it is. Okay. As you can see, I have almost as much trouble being prepared for this stuff as you do. Then we get the whole expansion. Now, while all this crazy stuff is going on, we have, first of all, the association with Bishop Godet de Marais. Hernandez writes it this way. I meant to check how Blair writes it. Actually, his name is de Marais. Marais is the French word for swamps. And this is the swamp area near where we have that school of the Franc Bourgeois today. That whole area where the Place Royale is and where Barré was living is known as Les Marais in Paris. And so they had the title to that land, and so that family did. And he had been an associate of De La Salle's. Well, he's very supportive of the brothers and the schools and so on and so forth. And Blanc, as usual, carries the story forward to the troubles that the brothers had under their successor, and the fact that when the Institute finally did get letters patent in 1725, that incorporation of St. Jan was able to be extended to Chartres. So there's a whole problem there of the Institute in Chartres, and at one point they tried to turn the Institute into a kind of monastic order, and there's a lot of statement about that, and so on, but this was a significant development, and you could go into a lot of detail about this. Chartres is just a little bit southwest of Paris, Calais is all the way up in the English Channel, and so we have the development there of a school in Calais, and then later on in Boulogne, and the province with the association with the bishop. The interesting thing about that, of course, is the finances. How did they finance the schools in Calais? Where'd they get the money? The confiscated property of the Huguenots. Huh?
Oh dear.
So the king says, oh yeah, we got a lot of money to support these things. We just confiscated a lot of these property belonging to these Huguenots, took all their money away from them, so they said, use that to pay the brothers. So it's not a very ecumenical kind of a thing. And then in Troyes, which is still a Champagne country, but that's south of Paris, and then the movement to Rome, the importance of Rome, and Avignon. I guess maybe we better start tomorrow with saying something about the importance of the Avignon Foundation and the movement of Roland to Rome. But if you've done the reading, you're ready for not only reading the letters of Gabriel Roland, but also we've seen where he comes in the narrative.
Did Desmarais and De La Salle have a big fight about the religious habit?
No, over the Latin.
Latin? Ah.